if you want to do what Trump is doing, then you have to do what dictators do, like Putin or like Hitler. The first thing you have to do is to create a group of people around you that are 100% loyal to you. And if they are not, you have to kill them. Napoleon said, "What's my problem?" Talleyrand said, "Well, your problem is that you are an excellent general." Oh, Napoleon said, "But that doesn't seem to be a problem." And Talleyrand said, "Well, the problem is that you go from victory to victory to victory to defeat."
You say cooperation is always motivated by self-interest. Is that what you mean?
Well, you look at climate change is a very clear example. We all know we will die if we don't do anything about temperature on Earth. But there's so much self-interest that we cannot really cooperate and we cannot really do something about it. Negotiate if you are strong. Don't negotiate if you are weak. And so when I was in Karabakh for the television and I said, negotiate now because you're in a good position, they said, we're not going to negotiate because we are in a good position. And then they lost everything.
And what does all of that tell us about the human nature?
If people don't see the necessity to work together, if there's no necessity, then why should you work together?
Does that mean for you that altruism is, in a sense, kind of a long-term egoism?
Strategy is to change a situation in such a way that it will be right for your victory. Wow.
Hello and welcome to Corporate Culture, your podcast about cooperation and conflict at work. My name is Paul Emtsev, and in this episode I spoke to Dr. Paul Meerts. Paul Meerts is a political scientist and international negotiation analyst. He wrote his PhD on the evolution of diplomatic negotiation and holds an honorary doctor title from Mongolian State University, as well as an Order of Merit of Austria and Romania. Paul became the head of diplomatic training at the Netherlands Society of International Affairs in the late 1970s, until he was nominated Deputy General Director in 1990. From 2006 to 2018, he was advisor and associate at the Dutch Clingendael Institute of International Relations, and until today, he delivers international negotiation seminars worldwide. In 2017, Paul also founded the Program on International Negotiation Training, a network of trainers and coaches in public sector international negotiation processes. With Paul, we talked about why we have so many conflicts around the world, how selfish human nature really is, what we can do to get out of destructive conflict dynamics, and much more. With all his knowledge and wisdom, Paul took me on an interesting tour through the history of international negotiation. So if you are looking for some new historical anecdotes about cooperation and conflict, this episode is for you. Let's get the conversation started. Here is Corporate Culture with Dr. Paul Meerts.
Then at the moment, you see a situation, I think, where the countries, as they usually do, but they perceive their own interest as more or less, without their allies. They don't care too much about their allies. They think they can do that because they are powerful enough. And so this is what you see with Trump. This is what you see with Mr. Rasputin, Vladimir Putin. This is what you see with the Chinese, who are coming back now after 1.5 centuries of being humiliated, which of course, especially for culture like the Chinese culture, is very difficult to accept humiliation. So this is what we see coming back. And the question is, of course, is this rational? Is this important? Is this really good for countries like the United States? Now, rationality is problematic, first of all, because your rationality might not be my rationality. My rationality will not be Chinese rationality or an American rationality, whatever. So the whole idea of Harvard that there should be a rational negotiator, I think is fake, because nobody is completely a rational negotiator, even if you play rational games. But in the end, it is also about emotions. And this is, of course, what we see with Trump, who wants to be in history as the guy who enlarged the United States with probably 20% of its territory by taking Greenland and things like that, and by capturing, in a way, Latin America again, etc., etc. From his position, from his ego, it's rational, but we have to ask ourselves, is this in the interest of the United States, or is it in the interest of Donald Trump and the clique around him? So is this about negotiation instead of negotiation? And does this imply that this is a short-term policy that will have long-term disastrous consequences for the United States? Because you can build up trust for 80 years with your allies, but if you betray them, it will be extremely difficult to get the trust back. And is it better for the United States to be the monopolist with a lot of vassal states, as it was the case, actually, same Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact? Or is it better for the US to have an Alleingang? That is something we cannot really judge today. But from my culture, my European vision, my European perception, I think it's unwise, because in the long run, it's much better for the United States to be the center of a network of countries. It's important for the dollar, it's important for the position of the US, it's important for their trade, it's important for everything, all the money they want to make, right? Because now we will say, hey, we should not be too dependent as far as IT, etc. is concerned. We should be independent. We should not be too dependent on their forces. We have to create our own forces. And it's very difficult for the US to undo this later on. And the question is, how will this transition period, how will it develop? Now, the United States, for example, if you look at the question of the forces, military side, security, they never wanted us European countries to create our own EU, NATO. They've always been against it. They always said, no, it's NATO as a whole. No, you should not organize yourself in a kind of European NATO. And now this is what they get. I mean, there are these stupid things like comparison, the Brits fighting Napoleon Bonaparte because they don't want a united continent. Then they are fighting Adolf Hitler because they don't want to have a united continent. And what do? They do Brexit. And what do they get? They get a united continent, right? And that context always has an enormous impact on the way people negotiate, how the negotiation processes develop or don't develop. So we are in a transition state, I think, and we still don't know if Trump will be powerful enough to change the situation in the US in such a way that he will go on this path with fans, etc., who's even more dangerous, I think, than Trump, or that the Republicans and the Democrats will get their act together and switch back to the old situation. But then the old situation will have to be renovated, will have to be restored, and that will take a long time, and it will be very difficult, and it will probably never be restored completely. Now, if you want to do what Trump is doing, then you have to do what dictators do, like Putin or like Hitler. The first thing you have to do is to create a group of people around you that are for 100% loyal to you. And if they are not, you have to kill them. As Machiavelli says, if you harm somebody, then he might take revenge. If you want to avoid that person or that country to take revenge, then you have to flatten it. Then you have to use genocide. Then you have to kill them. And of course, this is something we thought we are not going to do anymore in this age and time. We are doing it again. Look at Gaza, I would dare to say. So that is the problem. He has to control his own clique. And if he's successful in controlling it, then maybe there will not be next elections in the United States for the new president, or there will be elections that people will be so afraid that they will vote for him or whatever, or they don't want to resist if he's changing the democratic system. As Machiavelli said as well, it's better to be feared than to be loved. And so this is what you're seeing. And first of all, I think then it is not about his control of the world or the environment of the United States. It's first of all about his control of his own people. because his own constituency, that is the problem for a negotiator, your constituency, not your opponent, not the other negotiator on the other side of the table. And so I think we are in this situation. We don't know what's going to happen. I think the Europeans should try to be brave. I think we should not give up Greenland. I also think we should not send soldiers to Greenland because that doesn't help at all. We should try to keep the status quo as long as possible, should try to negotiate, but we should not show that we are so afraid that we give up things even before we're going to negotiate about it. In that sense, Mr. Rutte, our former prime minister, is an interesting figure. We always said he didn't have a vision. And that's true. And if you don't have a vision, then you're ideal as a Secretary General of NATO or Secretary General of the UN because you're not in the way of the member states. So he's flattering Trump because he says it doesn't cost anything. And if it's effective, okay. But if it's not effective, then his strategy is unwise. We see with Zelensky that Zelensky tries to combine the two, be tough on the one hand, be also lenient, but not too lenient. Zelensky, in that sense, I think is an excellent negotiator, a very good example of what an effective negotiator should be. I hope I answered your question a bit.
Yeah, definitely, in very much detail even. And I was especially intrigued by your ideas about cooperation and also the motivation behind cooperation. And I understood you in a way that you say cooperation is always motivated by self-interest. Is that what you mean?
That's what I mean, but the question is, of course, what's self-interest? If you are too much focusing on self-interest, then cooperation will be difficult, and in the long run, it will not be in your interest anymore. So they have this tension between short-term and long-term. Now, companies typically think short-term because they want to provide money for those who invest in the company. Countries should think long-term, and some do. But politicians in democracies, they are elected, and so they have to think about the next 4 years or whatever, the next election. So they also tend to think short-term. The diplomats, the professionals, might think long-term. And so there's already a tension in the government between those politicians who are representing a certain region in their country who have no notion about international politics. We had an example of this, Mr. Karamans, who thought that he could deal with the Chinese by escalating against them, which is completely foolish. Don't escalate against the Chinese. I mean, if you can avoid escalation, try to avoid it and try to cooperate with them. If he doesn't have the power, then how could you do that? But he overestimates himself. And this is what Trump is maybe doing as well. And this is what Putin is doing as well. They overestimate themselves. They get greedy. They want more. And that creates entrapment. And in the end, entrapment might lead to a disaster. You might lose. You might lose Afghanistan. You might lose Iraq. You might lose Vietnam, etc., etc. Maybe even you will lose Venezuela. Can you really contain the situation? And that is the question. So this long-term thinking is absent, and it means that, for example, you look at climate change is a very clear example. We all know we will die if we don't do anything about temperature on Earth. But there's so much self-interest that we cannot really cooperate and we cannot really do something about it. So while we know we will all die, we cannot get ourselves to cooperate because at the moment the costs are too high. Well, in the end, the costs will be so high that we cannot really contain it anymore. And this happened several times. Let me give a few examples, if I may. One famous example is the Paris negotiations, which ended up in the Treaty of Versailles. So the question is, should we have the Germans at the table who lost the First World War? Yes or no? And Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, says we should not have the Germans at the table because millions of French died, and I will lose my position in France if I have the Germans at the table. So I don't want to do that. But, of course, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And the Germans were angry about that. Now, didn't they realize what mistake they made? Of course they knew. Jean Monnet, who was a very young assistant of Mr. Clemenceau, said to his prime minister, Monsieur le Premier Ministre, if you don't have the Germans at the table, they still have a larger population than we have. You will have another war in 20 years' time. And Clemenceau, I know, he said, I know, but I cannot do it otherwise. We know it, and we can do it, even if we want it. We had the Oslo agreements, they killed Rabin, right? We had an agreement on Nagorno-Karabakh in 1999, and the prime minister who concluded the agreement with Aliyev was the president of Azerbaijan. They shot him in the Armenian parliament, and they still say today they don't know who did this. And it was off, there was no deal. But everybody knew that after the Armenians won the war in 1994 against Azerbaijan, because the Armenians wanted to have Karabakh in the end as part of Armenia, although they always said, oh no, this should be a separate state. But I mean, there was an Armenian diplomat who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Karabakh. And, this was fake. No, they wanted it as part of Armenia. They knew after the war that there would be another war. And as Armenia is poor, and as Azerbaijan has a lot of gas and oil, they knew that at a certain moment there would be enough money in Azerbaijan to create a new army, a well-armed army, that they would attack again Artsakh, which is their name for Karabakh, Armenian name for Karabakh, and that they would win the war. We wrote a simulation game about that. So in 1995, what will we foresee in 25 years there will be another war and the Armenians will lose it. So they have to negotiate first. Negotiate if you are strong. Don't negotiate if you are weak. And so when I was in Karabakh for the television and I said, negotiate now because you're in a good position, they said, we're not going to negotiate because we are in a good position. And then they lost everything.
And so that again is the problem, like with the long-term versus short-term thinking that you mentioned before?
Absolutely. Yeah. And diplomacy is, look at Talleyrand, for example, the prime minister of Napoleon. He was long-term thinking. He already thought about the downfall of Napoleon while Napoleon was still expanding France. But Talleyrand knew at a certain moment there will be an end to this. Let me prepare for the situation where Napoleon will lose the war. Let me already contact Metternich, the Chancellor of Austria, the Tsar Alexander of Russia, so that I can do something if Napoleon is going to lose the war. And Napoleon was informed by him. And Napoleon knew that things would happen that were not positive for him. So he said, Talleyrand said to Napoleon, Your Highness, you have a problem. Napoleon said, what's my problem? Talleyrand said, well, your problem is that you're an excellent general. Oh, Napoleon said, but it doesn't seem to be a problem. And Talleyrand said, well, the problem is that you go from victory to victory to victory to defeat. But Napoleon didn't want to accept that. Short-term thinking lost everything.
And do you have any idea how to get out of this self-destructive mindset of like how to bring people or how to bring ourselves into more long-term thinking? Is that even possible?
Well, if I'm rude and undiplomatic, I would say at least kill Putin. But you can't kill him. Yes, what we have here and what we have is Napoleon, what we have in this present situation as well is the dynamics of entrapment. Entrapment is a situation in which you don't want to be in that situation. You try to get out of that situation by investing more into the situation. So let me give an example. I'm going to a casino and I have 300 euros and I put 150 on the table, and then I lose and I put another 150 on the table and I lose again. So now I should stop. Rationally speaking, I should stop. But of course you are there and we had this wonderful interview. So I'm going to you and said, can I please, Paul, can I, after all we are both Paul, can I borrow 300 euro from you? And you shouldn't do that because I cannot be trusted, of course.
Mhm.
But okay, I shouldn't do that. I am investing in a downward spiral. You got sunk cost, as Kahneman says. So this is what you see in Vietnam. The more soldiers Americans were losing in Vietnam, the more soldiers they were sending to Vietnam. And that is entrapment. And you might say that Putin and Zelensky are both entrapped. It's mutual entrapment. It's a tunnel, and it can be used sometimes by the weaker party. Taliban used it against NATO. NATO much more structural power than Taliban, but Taliban had situational power. And situational power is sometimes much more effective than structural power. Children are normally much more effective negotiators than their parents, although the children don't have a house, they don't have a car, they don't have a salary, but they have the love, the relationship with the parent, then they use the relationship to blackmail the parent, and then normally, although they seem to be weaker, they are more successful. Now, how to get out of that entrapment? Because the guerrillas, let's say, will try to use the other side, which is more powerful, to get into this trap. And the other side, in a way, is pushing itself into the trap because they're so powerful that they go on and go on and go on, and the situation is getting worse and worse and worse. Of course, famous examples in history about this, the French nobility that has been defeated 3 times in the same way by the British archers, bowmen, because the French thought that they could win anyway. And so they were in a swamp, and they were sinking in the swamp, and they were killed by a small British army, English army. And this happened 3 times. The last time in Azincourt, when I was in Azincourt, I saw some British tourists, and I said, "Are you still proud about it?" And they said, "Yeah, we're still proud about it." I mean, we talk about 1384 or whatever, These things don't go away. That is the shadow of the past, and that also overshadows the present. Therefore, we might not have a common future. Now, there are many examples of this. Gaza is probably one. The Armenians at least could go to Armenia. Where are the Gazans going to? So, where are we now? We are in a situation where we need a new leader, because the old leader is responsible for all those losses of human lives and all this material destruction. So if you look at theory on entrapment, what you see is you have to need a change in leadership. If you don't get that, then you cannot get out of the trap. And do we see this? Yes, we see this. The Democrats, Kennedy, Johnson, they were responsible for what they did in Vietnam. It took a Republican to take them out. Republicans were responsible for what they did in Iraq and Afghanistan. It took Obama, a Democrat, to take them out. The French were in the civil war in Algeria. General de Gaulle was not responsible for that. When he came to power, he could take the French out of Algeria because he was not responsible for the bloodshed. So normally, according to theory, you need new leaders who can say, it's not our fault, we are going to change the situation in such a way that we can have a common future. And that is, of course, what the French did and the Germans did after the Second World War. They were more or less forced to do it because the Americans, of course, put pressure on them, but also because the threat of the Soviet Union, right? It's quite clear, you often need external threat in order to create internal unity, as we know. And this is what we see now. That's the positive side of the threat of Putin, is that finally, and of the threat of Trump, finally Europe is getting its act together. But to deal with the past is maybe the most difficult thing. And why didn't the Armenians want to have an agreement with the Azerbaijanis, for example? They could have said, we want full autonomy within Azerbaijan, because they didn't trust the Azerbaijanis. And why didn't they trust them? Not because the Azerbaijanis are not to be trusted. Maybe they are not to be trusted, but because of history, because their ancestors in Western Armenia, that is Eastern Turkey, were killed by the thousands by the Ottoman Turks. So the Azerbaijanis are Turks. So they see the Azerbaijanis as the Turks, those who killed their ancestors, and therefore they're not willing to work with them. Although it's in the interest of Armenia to work with Turkey, because Armenia is poor. No, it's still very difficult because of what happened in the past. And as somebody said, everything withers away. but not the past.
Mm.
And how to deal with the legacy of the past. And if you talk about emotion, that's about emotion. That is about trauma. But if you can deal with it like the French did and the Germans did, then you can have a common future. But not if you're not going to deal with it. And that again is about long-term, short-term, but it is long-term looking at the past. And in that sense, it's very difficult for people to say, okay, let's not forget about the past, but it should not dominate the present. Extremely difficult, and it's cultural. Let's say for us Dutch, okay, so what happened in the past with Spain? We were part of Spain. We had a revolution against Spain. We won the revolution. Okay, that helps. But or that the French occupied the Netherlands, or the Germans, even the Germans now, we are dealing with them in a more or less normal way. But in a culture like Turkish culture or Middle Eastern culture, where faith is so important, where honor is so important, where people are ready to die for their country, for the honor of their country, then it's very difficult to accept that the past wasn't positive, and we should now say, okay, let's start to work together, because it's in the interest of both countries to do that. So culture comes in as well, I think.
And what does all of that tell us about the human nature? Is it only driven by self-interest? Is there also a cooperative part in human nature? What are your thoughts on human nature in general?
Well, of course, there's a cooperative part. The question is, what's the level of cooperation? Normally in families, families cooperate. Clans cooperate. Tribes within the tribe, the clans cooperate. But what happens if there is a problem and the clans start to fight with each other? Then there is no cooperation at all. And this means that everybody will suffer, that you won't have a win-win situation. You get a lose-lose situation. And that's, of course, a problem in Africa, where you have different tribes and how to get these tribes to work together. So it isn't really just self-interest, because it can be in your self-interest to work together. And why shouldn't you do that? Maybe you shouldn't do it because you cannot trust the other side. Now, I think people can trust each other, but I don't think states can trust each other. But states can control each other. And that is what we do in Europe. We control each other in the European Union, and therefore we can cooperate. But even if Mr. Orban doesn't want to cooperate, and even if he's, let's say, anti-Ukraine, he is actually, because he wants to have a part of Ukraine, the part where there is a huge, at least was a huge Hungarian minority. He wants to have it back. The Peace of Trianon is still in the mind of all Hungarians. You go to any cafe and you see the old map of Hungary, never the present map. So that is the question. You can control each other. But if you look at things like tribes, a good example, there are two examples here, I think. One example is the Prophet Muhammad united the Arab tribes. This created a lot of energy that went outside. So because they were united, because they were not fighting with each other anymore, although later on they did, of course, but they could defeat the Byzantines, they could defeat the Persians, and so on and so on. The energy went from inside to outside. And a better example is maybe even Genghis Khan, who united the Mongolian tribes, and actually also the Turkic tribes, in that part of the world, in Manchuria, Mongolia, etc. And by uniting them in a certain way, created such a power that they created they formed the biggest country ever in world history, from the Chinese Sea to the Adriatic, because he put an end to the internal strife. And then the energy goes outside. So the problem is that often, if you want to have this context change, you need somebody who's ready to do that. There will be opposition in democratic countries. He doesn't need to bother about it. He can just decide. And this is one of the reasons why we see China becoming stronger and stronger and stronger. Now, I would never like to live in a country like that. But, the agreement, they force the agreement upon you. But to get the agreement between countries or people who are equal, that's very difficult. It's the democratic system we need, and that's correct, and I want it, but it doesn't always help us to be effective. So self-interest can be interpreted in different ways.
What do you think about people who acted very altruistically? I mean, there are a lot of historical figures that acted very altruistically, selfless. Mother Teresa, for example, or some others.
Mandela.
Is that, yeah, exactly, like many more. Are those people kind of exceptions, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, you don't mention the most interesting one and the most well-known one, Jesus Christ.
Yeah,
Look
that's a
at
good example.
Look at the impact of that guy on the world. Once I said to my Russian students when I was still teaching in Moscow at MGIMO, the International University, that although I know, of course, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in Russia, so I was teasing them. And I said, what I really admire about you, that you Russians, you really like the Jews. I said, what? What are you talking about? I said, well, you admire the Jews. Look at it. Jesus Christ, Karl Marx. Wow, yeah. That's not what they meant. Not the idea. But the impact of that man, who wasn't a Christian, of course, not yet. I mean, he never was. The impact of that man is enormous. So in the long run, and we come back to short-term, long run, in the long run, if you can be altruistic in a certain way, even if you have to suffer yourself, look at Buddha. That can have much more of an impact than if you're just trying to grab whatever you can grab. Because in history, you won't go down as the person people will love. But again, you have the problem here of short-term and long-term.
I mean, in that case, it's that much long-term that you will not even live it yourself, right? So you basically,
exactly.
Yeah. And probably most people are not ready for that, I assume.
No, and one of the problems is that politicians should not be naive. And that politicians, let's say the most effective politicians often are people who are not naive at all and who are manipulating their environment. That's no problem if they are manipulating their environment for something that is good for the country or whatever, right? If they're altruistic in the sense that the goal should be, the end game should be in the interest of the people they are responsible for, but short term, they might do things that are not altruistic at all. If they are really altruistic and they are a politician, then this can be extremely problematic. So I won't name him, but my former director, Clingendael, who later on became Minister of Defense, he's a very altruistic guy. He's trying to do a lot for Ukraine, getting money, helping the people, things like that. And he was, at a certain moment, Minister of Defense. He was manipulated by his own military officers, and the result was Srebrenica, where so many Muslims died because the Dutch soldiers who had to protect them didn't protect them, because they thought, the Serbs take these men and boys away and it will be all right in our society. We could not imagine that they would kill them, and they would kill in the day after 7,000 people. And so you should not be naive, because then it can have disastrous results. But at the same time, it's about your long-term goal.
Does that mean for you that altruism is, in a sense, a kind of a long-term egoism?
Yes.
So that, okay.
Yeah, okay. I think so. Yeah. And that is where I think Trump is making the mistake, that long-term, this will not be good for the United States. And especially not only because of its place in the world, but what is going to happen in the US itself? Will democracy survive? Will people start to fight with each other? Will there be another civil war like there was in the past? It might ruin the United States. It ruined Yugoslavia. Yeah, Tito was a nice guy. He had concentration camps, etc., etc. It's important to understand Tito had parents from Croatia and Slovenia. He was not Serbian. So when he was the dictator of Yugoslavia, he suppressed the Serbs, and he saw to it that Serbia proper would be quite small, because Kosovo got its autonomy, Vojvodina got its autonomy, then the others were republics. So the Serbs were part of Yugoslavia, but they were contained by Tito, right? Tito saw to it that more or less everybody worked together. The problem was, the moment Tito is dead, the other people will have to run the country. And it went well for about 10 years, but then it collapsed, because there was no central figure who said there is a kind of common interest here. So all the particular interest came to the fore. Of course, it also had to do what happened in the Second World War, where the Croats especially supported the Nazis against the others and things like that. It all came up, of course. And then Yugoslavia fell apart. That's a lose-lose situation, right? Switzerland is the opposite. Switzerland is a country that, like Yugoslavia, should not exist. They have Catholics in the north. No, sorry, they have Protestants in the north. They have Catholics in the south. They have French speakers in the west. They have German speakers in the north. They have Italian speakers in the south, and even Rätoroman, something else. They have no ports. They have no natural resources. They have an extremely expensive agriculture. This country should not exist. This country should fall apart. But this country is the richest country in Europe. They understood, if we fight each other, we will be taken, occupied, dominated by Germany, France, maybe Italy. I don't know. So we have to work together, because otherwise we will lose. And they had a civil war in medieval times. And the lesson learned by the elite was, let's have a kind of democracy. Let's stick together. And still the French speakers, the francophonie, they don't like the German speakers in Zurich. But it doesn't mean that they're going to fight with each other. They're still cooperating. And another example is the Netherlands. If the farmers are not working together, building a dike together against the sea, then all the land will be flooded and the farmers will have no land anymore. They are forced to cooperate. And this is very interesting to see how you can go against the odds by working together, if you understand that this is necessary and this should overshadow your particular interest that you have at the moment.
Like if we think, for example, about Thomas Hobbes, do you think that you really need an external or some sort of pressure for people to cooperate, or could it also be a purpose in itself to cooperate just for the sake of it?
Of course, it can be a purpose in itself for the sake of it, yes. But I'm afraid that human nature doesn't allow for that. If people don't see the necessity to work together, if there's no necessity, then why should you work together? Of course, here, let's say I'm living in The Hague and we understand that we have to work together, because then our street will be clean and we will have electricity, water, and things like that, right? But if that is under pressure, there can happen two things. Either we start to cooperate better together, or we will fall apart, because some groups will support the enemy and some others won't. An example is the Second World War. When the Germans took over the Netherlands, 90% of the population did nothing. They just went on with their life. 5% became Nazis and helped the Germans because it was in their interest. They got good jobs and things like that. And 5% was in the resistance because they saw long-term, this is not good. We want democracy. We're ready to die for it. So that is a kind of altruism that you then need. that they were sacrificing themselves for the country and for the population of the Netherlands. So yeah, you need external pressure, but it's just not enough. We always think about a bit, let's say, black and white, either this or that, but you need both. You need both. You need to have a certain self-interest, but you also need to understand that it can be materialized by working together with others and not trying to get everything. The bankers tried to get everything. They were greedy, more money, and then what you get 2008, a complete disaster. And that is entrapment as well, because entrapment is often created by the greed of certain countries or people or whatever. And that's what we see now, the greed of the US, the greed of Russia. And it is not in the interest of the Russian population to do this. They're getting poor. They lose their family members. Why the hell are they doing this? I mean, yeah, they are doing this because maybe it's not only Putin. They want to restore the old Tsarist empire.
I think that people like you and me, we really want to support cooperation. I mean, this whole podcast is called corporate culture, so we are probably also kind of idealists who want that people work better together. And now I'm wondering, is it really always necessary to cooperate? I mean, can it also be a good alternative to just have a coexistence? It means we are not in a conflict, but we also don't cooperate. Is that sometimes maybe even the better solution than forcing cooperation at whatever cost?
Yeah, and I will go back to the Second World War. The majority, 90% of the population, was just existing, was not cooperating with the Germans, and were not fighting against the Germans. The problem then is, in that situation, dictatorship will be continued, etc., etc. If you want to change it, you need friction. And then you need to cooperate in groups and then a friction with the other group. We think cooperation is better because I see negotiation as war by peaceful means. So it doesn't mean that we have to be nice to each other, but it means that we have to use words instead of weapons. And that is the change that happened in Europe with the European Union. We're still fighting with each other. The French are still fighting with the Germans, but they're fighting with the Germans with words and not with weapons. And so there is a change in the methodology you use, right? Because we think otherwise we get destruction. And destruction is a lose-lose situation. And yes, there are situations, and then you think about the Thomas Gilman model where you have avoidance, for example, you have collaboration, you have competition, you have giving in, being lenient, accommodation, and you have compromise. And in certain situations, you should indeed maybe avoid, because situation is not ripe. You will not get out anything. It's better not to do something. That is cultural as well. For the Americans, I think it will be very difficult not to do something. They say, let's do it, and they do it, and maybe they shouldn't have done it, right? I think in Chinese culture, that's much more easy. Time is not yet right to take Taiwan. Let's wait for the right time, the right moment, and then we will do this. It's typically Talleyrand, when I talked about the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Napoleon. Napoleon hated him at a certain moment, and he worked for about 6 regimes or whatever, but time and timing. You see it with us when we are trainers, for example, and we have this group point program on international negotiation training. And yesterday, Ida Manton, she's in the United States, she's from Macedonia, and we work together, a former student. And she said, yeah, but we trainers, we should all work together. Much more than we do today. And why are we not doing that? Well, we have the conference the beginning of July in Paris, but that's it. I said, yeah, but this is natural, because trainers are also competitors of each other. They are both competitors and they can cooperate. They cooperate for a tender, for example, because otherwise they won't get the tender. But if they're outside the tender, they will compete with the other tender, because if the other tender wins, then they will lose everything. So it is a question of cooperation and competition at the same time. And sometimes, yes, you should avoid, you shouldn't do anything. Time is not yet ripe. And just to say we should always cooperate, that's not realistic. And to say we should always compete, that's not realistic either. Because in the end, everybody might lose. Look at your former Yugoslavia. So the question is, what are we going to select? What are we going to do? Which tactic, which strategy is the correct one? And context then, come back to what we said at the beginning, is extremely important. There's a famous Chinese general who wrote a book about the art of war, Sun Tzu. More or less everybody knows about him. And Sun Tzu defines strategy. And he says, strategy is to change a situation in such a way that it will be ripe for your victory. Wow. So we cannot solve the Cyprus problem as long as there is no situation where it is important for the southern side, the Greek side, who've twice said no in the referendum to unification with the North, the Turkish side. If there is no need for them to reunify, then they won't do that. And there was a chance recently to do it because there was oil and gas is found south of Cyprus. Mr. Erdogan, the president of Turkey, said, okay, let's reunify the island because I need that oil and gas, and it should go through pipelines through Cyprus to Anatolia, because at that moment he had still his problems with Assad in Syria. He didn't get the natural resources he needed. So let's put an end to it. And then in the end, it didn't work. There was another moment where the European Union said, Cyprus, if you want to become a member of the European Union, that's okay. But we don't want an island, part of the European Union, where there are foreign troops on its soil, in this case, Turkish troops. So you have to reunify before you can be a member. And then the Cypriots in the south, they were not stupid. And they said to Greece, all countries of the EU will have to agree to enlargement. So Greece veto enlargement of the European Union if the European Union doesn't want to take us in as a divided island. And so the consequence was that it's a question of priority. And negotiation is about setting your priorities. So the Germans said our priority is to have Poland in, and Czech Republic, and Slovak Republic, and Hungary, and so on. That's our priority. And we are enlarging now with 10 countries. So let's accept Malta and Cyprus as well, because Cyprus is not important to us. So Cyprus was winning. Well, they were much weaker than the European Union. They were winning because of the context of that moment. And what should have been done is to say we're going to enlarge with the countries in Central Europe, and we will negotiate later with Cyprus and Malta, so that you already accomplish that. And then you are in a stronger position because there's context change, and then you might force Cyprus to become a member, to reunite, and then become a member of the European Union if they want that. The same is true for Moldova now. Some people say, how could Moldova be a member of the European Union? Because part of it, Transnistria, is not under the control of the government in Chisinau. Yeah, but there's the Cyprus example. So context.
Hmm. Can I ask you what motivates you to do your work? Because we talked a lot about human nature, about the selfishness of human nature. And I'm really curious because people like you and me who really want to promote cooperation, we obviously are also driven by some motivation behind it. And I'm curious what you think about that. Are we also in the end selfish by promoting cooperation, or why are we doing this? What do you think?
Well, I think it's both. I'm a political scientist. But I saw at my institute, Clingendael, that we only had lectures, etc. So I thought, if I want to have a more important position in my institute, if I want to be something useful for my institute, which also strengthens my position in the institute, then I should invent something that is relatively new. And I've always been doing simulation games more or less all my life. And I thought, yeah, but that's not enough. There's a negotiation process there, and we should develop the insight in negotiation. So this was selfish because then I could develop something that was quite unknown in the political dimension, and it gave me an opportunity to travel around the world. And I've been teaching in 100 countries. So I saw the world because I understood when I'm old, as I'm now, then I'm not willing to go to Mongolia 8 times anymore, right? So that is my self-interest. But of course, I'm also doing it because I believe it is better for the world and for those countries to work together, because otherwise people will die, etc., etc. So why should we create a situation like that? So it is on the one hand self-interest, but on the other hand, it's also your vision. Otherwise, why would you study political science or international relations if you're not really interested in the situation in the world? That you also, it feels good to help people. It feels good for me to have Zoom in Ternopil in Ukraine to get the students to think about peaceful cooperation, even at the time that they might be called to the front, right? So again, you should not shy away from that. So this is what it has to do with your upbringing as well. It has to do with your parents. What was the vision of your parents about the world? Things like that. And you try unconsciously, I think, to do what they wanted you to do. And if they thought we should have a democratic world or whatever, especially after what their experiences in the Second World War, then as their child, I think normally you would try to, with other means, to further this. It's difficult to explain. It's in a way, again, a combination of rationality and emotion.
Yeah. I mean, I like also your level of self-reflection of saying, yeah, there's a selfish element. And maybe also if you think about the moral aspect, in a way, it also makes us feel good to believe that we are doing the right thing.
That's true. But I do believe that morality in international relations doesn't really exist. And if you see all these peace-loving people, for example, we have the peace policy, etc. The peace. It doesn't go like that. It doesn't go like that. You have to be realistic as well. So there was a European movement before the First World War, and the people said these people, these pro-EU or pro, let's say, common Europe, these people are crazy, huh? And then you got the First World War, and that wasn't enough to understand that it would be useful to have a united Europe, because Europe destroyed itself and its colonial empire. And at a very late stage, the Soviet Union was the last colonial empire, you might say, and it fell apart. But it wasn't enough, and we needed the Second World War to understand, come on, peacefully working together is in our interest. But it took half a century before the people saw, the EU, that's not a crazy idea. It might work. And it worked. But it worked because we had the war. So, of course, as Johan Cruyff says, every disadvantage has an advantage. So we learned that these wars were terrible. Then there was the Soviet Union threatening to overrun Europe. So we learned that we should not only have a European Union, or whatever you called it at the time, but we should go on integrating further. We didn't integrate in the field of security because we were in NATO and the US didn't want it. And now we are integrating in the field of security because of Trump, right? So there should also be an external need, and that cannot always be a positive one. But the trick for diplomats and politicians is to use it in such a way that in the end it will be good for us.
I have one last question, which sounds maybe a bit off topic after we talked a lot about war and conflicts, but it's the role of play in conflicts. Because you said also before, we need some form of pressure or of need as an impulse to cooperate. And when I think now about play in the sense of playing a game or playing soccer together or animals playing with each other, I see some benefit in that which is not really rational, but just playing for the sake of it. And I feel that we humans, we also really like to play. I think that without any form of play, our life would be very boring and very sad. Um, and I'm wondering if play as a force could also be used somehow in negotiation and in conflict. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. There's a famous Dutch historian, Huizinga, who wrote the book Homo Ludens.
Hmm.
He said life is a serious play. And those who are not serious about it, they are destroying the game. In Dutch, he says it in a very concise way, but I cannot translate that in English. It's not translatable. And I think that is true. And what I did and tried to do was in order to get people to understand how international relations work, to throw them through the simulation games, because then they experience how important and difficult it is to negotiate, and what are the limits of it, and how can we deal with the limits. So last Friday, I did the simulation game with the students. Was about Kosovo, Serbia, under the mediation of Robert Cooper, a British guy on behalf of the European External Action Service, so let's say the EU. And so they did this exercise trying to get an agreement on borders between Serbia and Kosovo. And then after that, we looked at the film. There's a film of that. And you see how in reality, the negotiators of Serbia and Kosovo are struggling with this issue, and what in the end is the problem. And the problem is not that the negotiators cannot deal with each other. The problem is they cannot deal with their own political masters back home. Right? So they have a common interest at the end. They want to have an agreement, but the struggle is with their own people. Now, so you use an exercise like that, you use a game like that to clarify reality. So I did this because I wanted people, and myself as well, to get a better understanding of international relations. As a child, I started to draw maps at a certain moment, maps of fantasy countries. And then we also needed armies, and then we also needed constitutions, and we needed, because if you have an army, first you are playing with toy soldiers, but if you are playing with toy soldiers, they should belong to a country. So if you have a country, you should have a map of your country. If you have a country, you should have a state structure, things like that. And then some people just do this for their own fun. Some others, like me, we do this with friends, etc., for the interaction. Because you create interaction, then you are confronted with problems and you have to solve them. So we had conferences. And for 50 years, I've been doing this with friends. With about 100 people in the end, if you add up everything. But in every game, there were about 10, sometimes 20. We went together on holidays, and then we had our conferences abroad and things like that. So we just did it for fun. That's what I call recreational simulations. And then it's one step to the educational simulation, where you use it in order to learn, right? And then you can develop this further as well. So I really believe in games. I'm not a gamer, although I'm a little bit of a war gamer, but I'm not really a gamer in the sense of what you're doing. Because that's a bit too abstract for me. Negotiation, diplomatic negotiation, is about words. It's not about figures so much as in private sector, but in public sector, it's about words, about language, things like that. So that's what I like, these conversations. And in that sense, I think these exercises are absolutely instrumental. I can talk to students about negotiation, explain all theory or whatever, and they will still not get it. Although the advantage of teaching negotiation is everybody knows what negotiation is about. One way or another, they all negotiated with their parents or whatever, so they know basically what it is, and that really, really helps. But if they don't experience it, then what I say, they will go in here, they will go out there.
Yeah.
Their experience, they will never forget about it. I met a former student yesterday, who is with the Navy. He was a commandant of of a submarine. And he said, I still remember what happened in 1983 at Clingendael Institute. I never forgot about it. It sticks.
That's amazing. Paul, thank you so much for all those anecdotes, those stories from hundreds of years ago. Like it was a big journey, I think, through many different times in history, and it showed me a lot of things about negotiation, about conflict, about cooperation, and about play in the end also. So thanks a lot for sharing all of that, and I really look forward to continue our discussion soon.
Well, it was in my self-interest because I enjoyed that talk.
Me too.